epistemological and an ontological, I'll talk about this distinction in a second, there's no transformation of the act. What is the fact that it occurred. No amount of punishment is going to undo. Nietzsche says, forgiveness does not extinguish. What is done is not undone. That someone forgets something is certainly no evidence that something has ceased to exist. The fact is, and this is the truth, this is the horrible truth, the fact is that no amount of forgiveness and no amount of punishment will ever be powerful enough to undo what is. What is, right? There's nothing that punishment can do to undo the fact. There's nothing that forgiveness can do to undo the fact. Now, again, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not going to get into the psychological discourse. From a logical standpoint, from a philosophical standpoint, Nietzsche is interested, this bit is an ontological critique of morality. It's a very technical and a very, I think, powerful critique of morality. The idea is, what real good is the system in getting me closer to an understanding of the truth if I, one, recognize that the system itself built on deception, that I always need to improve myself. One aspect of improving myself is forgiveness. So I continually try to forgive the person that did this grievous act to me. But the attempt to forgive in no sense transforms the fact. The fact is that this occurred. The fact is that this occurred. How do you incorporate a Nietzschean perspective in order to get sort of alleviation to the problem? Nietzsche might say, I can't say that he would say this, but based on this Nietzschean interpretation, it's not about just the punishment of the individual. That's not going to bring, nothing really will bring closure. Nothing's going to transform the fact that the incident occurred. Forgiveness is not going to transform what occurred, but at least an acknowledgement. Hey, I want you, perpetrator, to acknowledge that you did what you did. I want to hear you say that, yes, in fact, you did that. That's as close to the truth as you'll ever get. Right? Because the deniability is always in the air. Whether it's explicitly stated or whether it's inferred, the perpetrator typically is going to deny the occurrence of the incident. That deniability allows us to forget, allows us to move on, allows us eventually maybe to forgive. What's more difficult for both the victim and the perpetrator, and this is where, if I were doing conflict resolution theory proper, I would say it would be awesome to incorporate Nietzsche into what's known as truth and reconciliation discussion, right? A truth and reconciliation transformation within the population. You can think Hutu, Tutsi, you can think any, Khmer versus Khmer, two populations living with each other, close proximity, seeing each other, one having been the perpetrator, one having been the victim. Really, it's an acknowledgement. Just acknowledge the fact that you did it. Me forgiving you is not going to change it. Me getting the authorities to punish you is not going to change it, but I at least want you to legitimize the fact that it occurred by confessing that it occurred. You were witness to the event. I was there, you were there, we know it occurred. If the perpetrator can, and I don't mean to put in scare quotes, but that's too much of a discussion to explain why I put in scare quotes, but if the actual perpetrator confesses and acknowledges the fact that, yes, I was present, I was there, you were there, this did happen, right? Then we can talk about everything else, right? But the idea is forgiveness as such is always yeah, I can forgive more and I can forgive more. It's always this process of becoming more moral. For Nietzsche, I think what would be more effective would be sort of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission type endeavor, right? The idea that the individual perpetrator and victim are at the table, quote unquote, and there is an acknowledgement of the incident in all of its graphic nature, right? This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and did this happen? Yes, it did. And did this happen? Yes, it did, right? And the victim and the perpetrator are able to identify all of the facts of the matter, because in the end, that's all that really matters. It's not about punishment. It's not about forgiveness. It's about, yes, this happened, and yes, you were the one that did that. And then you can say, well, can't you see how this would have affected me, blah, 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 right? But the idea is that neither punishment nor forgiveness is going to transform the act as being morally reprehensible. The only thing that you have, and it's not a lot, but I mean, it would be great. It would be really a step. And now just imagine if the perpetrator were to come to the victim years later and be like, you know, I acknowledge the fact that I did X to you at time T. Right, and I'm sorry for that. Holy crap, what the hell? But they never do, right? They never acknowledge it. Well, I can't say they never do. Lots of people will confess and will admit, yes, in fact, that happened. You know, I was a participant. But the idea is that the discourse has to be about the totality of the event, right? Unless it was just one event, right? But even that one event, there are many, many different layers to the event, right? So that for Nietzsche, it's not about forgiveness, and it's not about punishment. It really is about the ontological recognition, the epistemological recognition of the ontological fact. Right? The epistemological, my knowing, you knowing, our knowing that the incident, the event occurred. Right? That's critical. As a quick side note, on Facebook last night, I posted this bit. And I said that I would be discussing it today, and I think a lot of contemporary feminist literature should investigate this, right? There's a huge discourse in feminist literature that pertains to the notion of forgiveness, and on a philosophical ground, I would say that that is, not for better or for worse, informed by a religious Christian influence. I think it would be interesting to try and situate the discourse outside of forgiveness with respect to whatever atrocities you can imagine, situated outside of forgiveness into a discourse of an epistemological recognition of the ontological event as event, perpetrator, victim. Were those roles static? This is why I put it in scare quotes, right? Was it always the case that the perpetrator was the perpetrator? Was the victim always the victim? If they were, okay. How do we go about making acknowledgments? And this is why I'm saying discourse and conflict resolution pertaining to Truth and Reconciliation Commissions can inform the philosophical discourse, the feminist discourse on notions of forgiveness, right? So, my 2 cents. So here's the assessment. Here Nietzsche challenges the notion of forgiveness and punishment. Though one may forgive the act, the act of forgiveness in no sense undoes the event, which is what I just said. They can never be undone. The event can never be undone. Thus, forgiveness functions as a deception, an inconsistency in becoming moral. Right? We saw that becoming moral is fundamentally a deceptive act inherent in the system, and the notion of forgiveness, forgive and forget, is a way of deceiving us. Right? Rather than, I can't, I have to be careful how I say this, because I don't want to encourage people to, delve into their respective darknesses. We all have darkness, right? But there is a sense in which, and I do feel the need to say this actually, there is a sense in which, as we said earlier, the church, on Nietzschean terms, would rather that you do not economize those dark aspects, as I said in the last section. Imagine that you are the victim of some act X, and it's it frames a lot of who you are as an adult. A lot of us, almost all of us, have some aspect of our life that does this. Instead